Brian Caffarelli.
Here.
Jay Gross is not here. Pam Iacono.
Here.
Don Matola. And John Wynn.
Here.
Okay.
So we have a quorum. That's good. All right, so next we're going to do the Pledge of Allegiance. So I pledge allegiance
To the flag.
To the
of
flag
the United States of
America.
to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God, indivisible, with liberty
and justice for all. Thank you. And then item number 3 on the agenda is approval of the minutes, and I will entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion.
I'll second. Pam Iacono.
Okay, the motion on the minutes of approving the minutes from December 9th, 2021 has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion, any changes to the minutes that anybody wants to mention? Hearing none, I will ask for a vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed? Any abstaining? I'm voting in favor as well. It passes. Item 4 on the agenda is a public comment on the adopted work plan. I did want to just again thank FairTV. I believe that they are broadcasting tonight. And again, thank those who have been emailing in to our email address, the commission. They are received and provided in backup. So it is helpful and always an avenue for you to communicate with the commission. But tonight, we did want to take an opportunity to hear from the public, because what we did in the first several meetings was hear from all the constituencies about their thoughts on how the charter was working, how it wasn't working, what should stay, what should go, any improvements that we could consider in our ultimate recommendation. So what came out of that, and thank you very much to Attorney Mednick and all those involved, Crew and Jen Carpenter, to help organize this, and the commission for their time last meeting to go through this. And what we've come up with is this proposed work plan that you will see. It was distributed I think in First Selectwoman's newsletter last week, and it's also on our website. And that is what we are taking comments from the public on. It lays out the schedule by date, and the proposed meeting topic tonight is after the public hearing, which we are limiting to 1 hour so that we can get into the work tonight as well. But we will be considering and hearing from several people who are experts, quite frankly, on the budgeting process in general and in town. And and then we will dive into the town governance the following 3 meetings, and then hear from the public again after we do that. So without further ado, if you would like to, and I should have started with this, I apologize. If you could raise your hand or put something in the chat, so that Prue knows to call on you, and then we could hear from members of the public on their comments on the proposed work plan. But so if you want to put something in the chat. In the meantime, any members of the commission have any comments on this? Attorney Mednick, did you have anything to add at this point? Okay, Prue, I think we're getting some.
Yes.
Some...
Okay, so I see Sarah Roy.
Yes, Miss Roy, good evening.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks so much for this opportunity. I know I've emailed the group before. My name is Sarah Roy, and I'm the chair of the Fairfield Bicycle and Pedestrian Committee. And I did email with Brian earlier this year regarding making sure that the committee is part of the charter, which we have not been in the past only because the charter was not revised until, I'm sorry, the charter has not been revised since 2006, and our committee was established in 2014. So it's really a matter of timing. But I did look over the work plan, and I really appreciate you putting us in there. I saw us on page 11. That's awesome. And as far as strengthening our complete streets policy for the town, I look to your guidance and other town leadership. If I don't know if the charter is the right avenue, I'm new to this. I've only been the chair for a few months, but we certainly, we want to make sure that we're in the charter so that we're not serving at the pleasure of whoever happens to be in the leadership at that time. But if the complete streets policy is not, if the town charter is not the right place for that discussion, that's totally fine, and we can have that discussion at another place another time. But just wanted to say thank you so much. Excited to see our committee and the work plan. So thank you.
Well, thanks for first of all, thanks for emailing, and I did appreciate that. Full disclosure, I ride my bike on the Fairfield streets, and and I'm happy and support your cause. But and thanks for joining us tonight. So your comments will be noted and taken up at the appropriate time. So if any other commission members have a comment, or question for Ms. Roy, now is the appropriate time. I don't see any, and I think I see everyone who's on. So John Matola is joining us. Maybe we'll give him a minute, but I'd like to thank you for joining us again tonight, Ms. Roy.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. Prue, who would be next from the public?
The next one is Kate Braun.
Okay. Ms. Braun, good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, there we go. I was
Hey.
trying to. I'm not used to my new iPhone yet. And I don't have. Oh, here's the
Happy New
video.
Year.
I'm in my car. There, you can't see me, but that's okay. I'm here. This is a process comment, not a substantive comment session, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, well, I guess semantics, right?
Yeah.
We are limiting it to the work plan, but I guess you could consider it substance if you say to us, well, what the heck, you forgot this large piece of the puzzle that should have been considered. I think that's substantive more than process, but it's really on. Here's what we've come up with after listening to everyone on what the thoughts and changes should be, what should be looked at. And if we're missing something that we're not looking at, I really want to hear, and I think the other commission members want to hear what that is, or if you're saying, well, why the heck are you looking at this at all? Also interested in hearing that.
Will there be a chance for the public to comment again? I know that this is the second public comment session, and I think that's required by the statute. But once the whole document is more redlined or proposed with all the substantive changes, can there be another opportunity for the public to weigh in and or elected and or department heads, like sort of a second bite at the apple once we see more detail about what's being proposed?
I'm going to defer to Attorney Mednick for that.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. This is actually not our second statutory public hearing. By law, we hold a public hearing at the beginning of the process, and we will hold, as you've requested, a public hearing as we approach the end of the process. And at that public hearing, you will have an opportunity to see the draft charter, 80, 90% done, 95% done. It's one of the final acts the commission makes before they take a final act on the charter. The chair and the members of this commission have been conducting public comment throughout the process. And as you can see, I think we've interspersed it in our schedule. So throughout the process, the commission is going to continue to ask for public dialogue, particularly at the end of a sequence of events, so that members of the public can pay attention to what we're doing in real time, so that when the commission is acting, they can do it with some sense of public direction before they take actions on the incremental portions of the charter. So so this is technically not the public hearing. The real public hearing will take place sometime in May, but there'll be a number of public meetings interspersed.
Thank
Mr.
you. I
Chairman.
very much appreciate that. That was my only concern. All my substantive comments I made earlier, so I'm not going to take everyone's time to repeat them again, but I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And
I don't have anyone else.
don't any members of the commission have any comments or questions for Kathy Braun? Okay, thank you very much for joining us. And I see for the John Matola, good evening and Happy New Year. So he's joined Supru. I'm sure you saw that as well. I think then at this point, one last call for any public comment on the proposed work plan. Okay, and as Attorney Mednick said, we do plan to check in with the public on a fairly regular basis. I think that if you look, we're slated to do that again on the third governance meeting, February 24th. So for the record, February 24th would be our next meeting that would have a public comment portion. So seeing no or hearing no more members of the public wishing to make a comment, I'm going to move on to agenda item number 5, the panel discussion and commission deliberations on the budget process and including the budget and appeals. And we have several people who have taken the time to be with us this evening. I want to thank them all for being here. And this is our first kind of substantive meeting, so my apologies. It might be a little clunky. I'm going to defer a lot to Steve Mednick, our attorney, who has been through this many times and knows the process. So Steve, do you kind of want to set the stage for how this evening is going to go? I know that you've spoken to these members, and then we can introduce them and proceed.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think most of our speakers are here. I know that Mr. Brown is out of state. We'll probably be calling in a little bit because I thought the public comment session would go at least till 7:30. Yeah. So I don't know if somebody knows how to reach him, might want to text him and let him know that we're starting a little earlier than we thought.
I believe he is signed on, Steve.
Yeah, he's on the call. Right,
oh, he is. Oh, okay, wonderful. There he is. Okay, great.
Hey.
Hello. Sorry.
He's a good-looking guy.
Hey, Steve.
Nice to meet you. So what I try to do with the commissions that I work with throughout the state as we go through the subject matter areas of the charter is to put together panels that will acquaint the members of the commission with the actual workings of the charter. What are the interactions between the people who actually represent the people of this town and the document that they follow as their local constitution, combined with the ordinances and other statutory guidance that they have. On this one, normally I might have some experts from around the state to look at the charter provision. I didn't get a sense from a lot of the comment that we had in our grid that there were major concerns with the budget process. So I thought that the best way to start would be to start with the local players in the process. And so we've invited 5 people here this evening to give you a sense of it. Jared Schmidt is the Chief Fiscal Officer of the town, and Linda Gardner has come back from her time of relaxation and retirement to be of assistance to show how the administration, the Board of Selectmen, begins the process and works through the process. They will kind of take us through the entire budget process. We will then move on, as the budget does through the charter, to the Board of Finance. And representing the Board of Finance here this evening will be Lori Charlton, who is the current chair of the Fairfield Board of Finance, and Jim Brown, who is a former chair of the Fairfield Board of Finance. And the hope would be that they would give us a very brief overview of their work, how they conduct themselves through the charter process, or through the process during the budget season, and give us their sense of how the charter works, how the charter doesn't work, what's missing, what they'd like to see going forward. And the final step, short of the referendum, if there is a referendum, is the RTM. And we're very happy to have this evening the moderator of the RTM, Mark McDermott. And again, he will discuss the role of the local legislative body, the RTM, in that process. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll defer to you if you want to start calling on the administration speakers.
Yeah, thank you very much, Attorney Mendick. And again, thank you all for joining us. I think probably what it would make sense to do just really quickly prior to getting into that is just having everyone. I'll call on you and just kind of give a brief introduction as to who you are, so we could go around to the I believe it's about 5 individuals who have joined us, and Steve just outlined. So Jared and Ms. Gardner, I'm sorry for the informality. I do know Jared for a while. So Mr. Schmidt, if you'd like to begin, if you could just kind of give us a brief intro on who you are, and then we'll just move to the chairwoman of the Board of Finance, and then Mr. Brown, and then the moderator. So Jared, if you want to kick that off, or.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm Jared Schmidt. I'm the Chief Fiscal Officer for the town. I started back in way back in October of 2020. And I'm sitting here with Linda Gardner, and I'll let her introduce herself.
My name is Linda Gardner, and I served as the town budget director from 1985 to 2020. So Jared and I overlapped for a few months. I had the pleasure of working with him. Great.
Well, they certainly have a lot of institutional knowledge that you can share with us, and I thank you both for being here. So if we could move on briefly to Chairwoman Charlton, just to thank you for joining us. Just a quick hello and introduction would be very much appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Caffarelli. Lori Charlton, as the chair mentioned, I'm the current chair of the Board of Finance. I was elected to the Board of Finance just a little over 2 years ago. My professional background, I am a recently retired audit partner with Deloitte. I also, in my professional career, was a controller and a CFO of a public and private company, and I have about 38 years of experience in finance altogether.
Well, thank you. And thank you again for your time and for joining us this evening and your service. Jim, Mr. Brown.
Yes, good evening.
How are you?
Jim Brown. I was on the Board of Finance for 12 years, served as vice chair for 8 years, while Mr. Flynn was the chair. And my last 2 years on the Board of Finance, I did serve as the chair. I'm a senior vice president at a private business in Stratford, Connecticut, and appreciate the opportunity to be here and willing to help in any way I can.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. And Mr. McDermott, the moderator of the RTM, good evening and thanks for being here.
Good evening and thank you for having me. Thank you, Chairman Caffarelli. Yes, my name is Mark McDermott, the current moderator of the RTM. This is my 4th term on the RTM. I was first elected in 2015 as just a regular guy. And 2017 session and 2019 session, I was the deputy moderator at that time, and was elected by my peers on the RTM as a moderator for this current term. I've lived in Fairfield for 17 years now. I have 2 daughters, one at Syracuse and one at a junior at Syracuse and a freshman at Fairfield Ludlow High School. coached a lot of rec soccer. I know Mr. Brown from years ago when he coached my older daughter back in the day. And obviously the Board of Finance, the USA and USA deck referee, swimming referee, and YMCA level 2 swim official. So I donate a lot of my time for free, and I've been 38 years in the textile industry, so right out of college.
Well, great. Well, thanks again for your service as well, and for joining us this evening. So we're going to turn first to Jared and Linda to give some background and overview of the budgeting process that the town goes through. And again, as Steve mentioned, you know, if you can highlight things where, you know, in your comments, how the charter works, maybe how it's not working so well, things that you think might be changed, things that you don't think we should change, to make the process more efficient and beneficial for not just you know, for the town, for the administration, for the government. I will ask any commissioners if they have any comments or before we begin, and then of course at the end. I imagine this to be kind of more of an interactive dialogue of questions and back and forth. So we'll get to that soon enough. But does any member of the commission have anything they want to say at this point? Okay, seeing none. Jared and Linda, you have the floor. And thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening to everybody. So I figured I would start by just giving an overview. We did submit a schedule of the budget process for this budget season. And so what I wanted to do is just go through some of the key dates in that process, just to give everybody a quick overview, if we could. What I'll do is I'll start with the last date, because really there's one key date at the end that a lot of the other formal specific dates are tied to. And that date is the first Monday in May, when the RTM holds their annual meeting to vote on the budget, and then a lot of the dates kind of work off of there.
If I could just I'm sorry for the interruption. So I just so everyone's on the same page. So we're working from the document number 2, correct the budget meeting dates. So that would be, I guess, page 12 of our backup documents, just so everyone has it. Thanks, and sorry for the interruption, Jared.
No, that's okay. Thank you. That's actually helpful, so everybody can follow along. Yeah, so I kind of started on page 12 where the RTM votes on the Monday, and then and now I'll go back to really the beginning, when the Board of Selectmen has to submit the budget to the Board of Finance for approval, which is 2 months earlier, no later than 2 months earlier. And the administration, the first Selectwoman, determines based on that date, whenever that date is, for the Board of Selectmen to submit the budget to the Board of Finance, and kind of work our way backwards to determine when the departments have to submit their budgets to us. Our review of the budget, that's mostly an internal function and determined internally when those things happen. So we, when the first Selectwoman presents her budget to the Board of Selectmen, there are 2 dates on the calendar right now. One is the presentation, and then there's another day for a vote, and you'll see that in the calendar there. So once the budget makes its way to the Board of Finance, there's also a presentation there done by the first Selectwoman and the department heads. There are on the schedule right now 5 budget hearings for the Board of Finance, 5 of them, and then there's another public budget comment session. So there are really 6 different meetings that could happen there. After the Board of Finance makes its way through the hearings, and holds its budget meeting, and the Board of Finance is required to vote 1 month before, at least 1 month before the RTM votes. So that's the latest that they could vote. And they will, they'll vote on that date, and then there's approximately, there will be about a month before the RTM votes, and the RTM has the authority to also hold their own hearings. And right now there are two hearings scheduled for the RTM, early April. So they would hold their votes, and then they would vote on it in this case, this year, on May 2nd, which is the first Monday in May. Technically, that's not the last day because there is a mill rate adoption day, which has to happen shortly after the RTM vote.
This is an old meeting. I was trying to go to it because there's a new meeting.
Well, there's someone who's called in that I don't. Okay, they muted themselves. Sorry for the interruption, Jared. Hello?
I believe Jared's line is muted right now.
Yeah. I thought I lost audio. Jared, we can't hear you.
I think I was trying to mute that person who was talking, and I must have muted Jared. Sorry.
Yeah. You're back.
Now,
You're back
okay.
on track. We probably missed the best part.
Can I ask when I lost you?
Just the
Anybody
last
remember?
30 seconds, but maybe 20 seconds.
So I may have just, the RTM does their vote on the first Monday in May,
Yep.
and then there's one more meeting after that to set the mill rate.
Okay.
And that's the culmination of the process.
All right.
And if there are any, I know that there are many other people who have much more experience than I do, including the person sitting across the table from me. So if anybody wants to clarify or highlight something that I may have missed, I'm happy to defer to them. If not, I would defer to Linda to do that, and also to give her view and maybe make some recommendations about how the process could be better.
Yeah, great. Let's hear from Linda then at this point, and then get into it.
Oh, I'm
Thank
happy
you.
to do so. Thank you. I would just like to say that in my 35 years of service to the town, I served under 8 different First Select women and Select men. And the reason why I mention that is in order to answer some of your questions, historically, the budget process has changed and evolved throughout those First Select people, if you will. And at different times, we did different processes. And so I may come back to one of those processes. But during that time, there have been several charter revisions, and the most recent charter revision, effective November 2006, actually predates the release of the first iPhone on June 29th, 2007.
Crazy.
So, in the interest of having our charter reflect today's available methods to inform the public and to inform ourselves, I would like to call your attention to Article 12, Section 12.3, Paragraph C. I'm getting into the weeds a little bit here, but I think we need to do that. Paragraph C in part states, the Board of Finance, quote, shall publish the final budget in a newspaper of general circulation in the town not later than 5 days before the annual budget meeting, end quote. Since hard copy newspapers are no longer the only means by which we can communicate with the public, you may wish to consider publishing the budget on the town's website. I believe this would maximize the availability of this very important information to our citizens as well as to our departments and commissions. And it would also reduce the town's advertising costs by more than $1,000. I would also suggest that you could consider switching the term, quote, final budget, which appears twice in paragraph C, to the Board of Finance recommended budget. The Board of Finance is not the final budget. The final budget is that which is approved by the RTM at the annual budget meeting. So that term is a misnomer. I have written out that paragraph with these changes. I won't read it to you, but it is in my written comments, which I would be happy to forward to you.
Please.
And next, excuse me?
Please do that. Please forward them.
I will do that. I will forward this to Jared tomorrow, and he can forward it to you.
Thank you.
Next, I would ask you to consider a change. This is a more substantive change to section 12.2, paragraph B. The last sentence, which reads, quote, the recommendation of the selectmen shall be submitted to the Board of Finance not later than 2 months before the annual budget meeting, end quote. The phrase, quote, not later than 2 months before the annual budget meeting, end quote, removes any flexibility for the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance may have to conduct joint budget hearings, as we have done in the past. If the sentence was changed to, the recommendation of the selectmen shall be submitted to the Board of Finance prior to the Board of Finance public budget executive session, then you would have the option of conducting separate hearings or conducting joint Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance hearings. This would give the boards that choice in any given year. The benefit of conducting joint budget hearings is offering the boards and the public a process which is streamlined and efficient to get their information. Joint budget hearings would offer the same information one time and at the same time. Now, some would say there is a disadvantage to holding joint hearings. The legislative bodies, the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, may feel a certain competition with one another and vie to make the best politically viewed recommendations first. In my view, the budget recommendations should never be considered a competition, but made only in the best interest of the town. And with that, I conclude and thank you for your time, your attention, and your consideration.
Well, thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could just to give a couple more comments and to add what Linda has said.
Please.
You know, one of the things that she talked about was, you know, getting up to date as far as technology goes, and being able to post the budget online. You know, as it's written now, there's not a lot of clarity, and I don't think they intended when they said to put the budget in the newspaper to take this, you know, this gigantic document and put it into the newspaper. So right now there's really, you know, it's an old charter provision, and it's not very clear on what that's supposed to be and what we're supposed to post. Anyway, we've kind of, I think over time, and Linda may be able to speak to this more, we've narrowed it down to a 5-page document.
It's a 5-page document, and what we normally do is we secure the centerfold of the Fairfield Citizen at a cost of a little over $1,000, and they print those 5 pages in the centerfold. And it is a summary of the revenues, the expenditures, elected official salaries, and length of terms.
And so right now, it's just that's not clear. There's nothing giving us guidance on to do that. It's just sort of the way that it's evolved over time. But to Linda's point about the joint meetings, there are a lot of meetings, and when you look at the calendar that we did submit, there are a lot of hearings that take our department heads away from their day-to-day duties in the administration, and we have to, we're really required to do those meetings in triplicate for the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, and the RTM, and so it does become onerous in that way. So I just wanted to, drive home that point and reiterate that. One of the other, if I could, I know that we're dealing with the budget section that's in 12. I think I saw on the agenda about section 4 of the. Are we looking at section 4 as well, dealing with the RTM, or no?
As it relates to the budget, let's see here. Where is section?
I thought the line item on the agenda also mentioned section 4 of the charter.
Yeah, Articles 4 and 12, correct. Budget process, including.
So
budget.
I'll say this, and if it's not appropriate for this meeting, then and I'll be quick. The process for getting things approved by the RTM that requires basically a 2-week lead time by the administration because of the way that their process is set up, having the main meeting and then having a committee's meeting a week before that, and requiring the submission of the agenda items a week, 5 days in advance of that. So essentially 2 weeks, and it's makes it difficult to plan when you have to think that far in ahead, or if we need something done quickly, it makes it difficult and a little bit onerous at times, depending on the item and the timing of the item.
Is that with regard to the budget, or of the other things as well?
No, it's not with regard to the budget, just generally approval of items.
Okay. All right. Well, that's noted. Anything else that you'd like to add before we? I have some questions, but I'm going to defer to the commissioners first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, those were the main points that we wanted to make, and happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, Attorney Mednick, I think.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, do you want to have all the speakers speak first, and then
that probably
can all
makes
be
sense.
available?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me about
kind of a panel discussion.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, that
makes more sense. So
thanks.
I'm gonna. I wrote mine down, so I'm not gonna forget. And I hope the other commissioners are doing the same. So then I guess we would go to the Chairwoman Charlton of the Board of Finance, and so to hear from you about kind of the process, how now the administration recapped their end of the the inner workings of getting the budget to you. How maybe you could give us your view on it, the process, and how it works well and how it could work better.
Sure, thanks. So I have a couple of thoughts. First, I do want to give a view on the comments made by Ms. Gardner and Mr. Schmidt, and I have a little bit of a different view, which may not be surprising. I think there's always a different perspective from management versus those who are in a legislative or oversight role. So I'll talk about that a little bit. I also want to get to, and by the way, I'm just ad-libbing here, so sorry if I'm all over the place, but I want to get to what you asked for at first, which is my perspective on what works, what doesn't work, and what might be missing. So from my perspective, I think the budget process works pretty well at the Board of Finance level. We do have a lot of meetings. The number of meetings we have, as you know, is not mandated by the charter. That's a process issue. And so, there can always be initiatives taken to look at that without changing the charter. We have a number of meetings because we set aside time at each meeting to explore different aspects of the budget, whether it be scheduling a certain block of department heads to speak to us, or reserving a night for the Board of Education, or reserving a night to hear from our actuaries about, pension and post-retirement costs, et cetera. So the evenings are pretty full. They're pretty robust discussions, and they're generally very informative and helpful. So I don't really have, could we do it in a more streamlined manner? Could we cut down the number of meetings? I think yes. I think we have certain meetings where, we have department heads before us for 2 minutes, and, we really don't have any questions about a particular budget because there aren't many changes from the prior year. So that might be something to get looked at. Other than that, from my perspective, I think the process works pretty well as it relates to our board. What doesn't work, maybe a little bit off topic or a related topic, I think one of the major shortfalls in our budget process as it relates to charter provisions, and I'm coming at this also from the fact that last night we just had our annual capital planning meeting. We don't have a capital budget process in our charter. And I think our process around capital planning and oversight over capital projects, candidly, is weak. I haven't done any benchmarking around other cities and towns formally. I do know informally because I've looked at a lot of other budgets just over the past couple of years as we were going through our budget process. And I do see that some cities and towns in Connecticut that I looked at have adopted capital budgets. But I do think that's an issue for us. And the reason I say that is because a budget process inherently brings a level of discipline along with it that I think is critically important, particularly in the public sector. So, for example, when we have our budget process for our operating budget, we have quarterly meetings, we get budget to actual updates, we have established procedures around, budget transfers or overages or carrying over appropriations, so there's a lot of oversight and transparency into what happens along the way after a budget's approved. That is absent from the capital planning process, largely absent. So, in some cases, if we have a large capital project and we have a building committee, we might have some level of oversight. But often what happens is that we approve a large capital project and then we never hear about it again. So we may approve a project and a bonding resolution based on an internal estimate of costs, and say that estimate was, $10 million, and then the town goes out to bid and they get a bid for $7 million. We never know that. There's no follow-up. There's no tracking that comes through any of the bodies just to look at any of that as you would with an operating budget. And by the way, the example I gave you is a real one. So there are always changes to a capital plan. Sometimes they go over, sometimes they go under. We bond for these things. The differences sit in limbo. And, I've heard several other elected officials describe this as sort of a black hole. And, I do think that the discipline of a budget process should be brought to our capital planning, because we spend a lot of money, and it's, and from my perspective, I think that's important. So I view that as a major gap. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, but I just offer that for what it's worth. I guess the last thing I'll say is I appreciate Mr. Schmidt and Ms. Gardner's perspective on wanting to streamline the process. Again, I have a little bit different view, and I understand their view because I've been on the other side, and in my entire professional career, I've never met anybody who loves doing the budget. Budgets always take a long time. Your people are always put through the paces. They have to answer a lot of questions. They go through multiple layers of review. And that's how they work. And I happen to believe that, you know, striving for maximum efficiency may be, I don't want to say misguided, but I don't think that should be the top priority. I think the budget process should be robust. I think it should be transparent. I think it's, for our board, certainly, it's the most important thing we do. It shouldn't be inefficient either. But I think efficiency as a goal for itself, I sort of, I'm not sure that's the right way to look at it. I think that we should be getting to the best process possible. And I think that some of the things that we can, or probably most or all of the things we can improve on are probably process issues versus charter issues. So that's my opinion. I don't think, and I want to say, the first selectwoman actually asked me about doing joint meetings for the budget this year, because the current charter gives us the flexibility to do that. And so, you know, I was certainly open to this suggestion and talked to a number of my colleagues. And I also talked to representatives from the Board of Ed who, you know, are one of the groups that has to come before us and present, and come before all the bodies and present. And honestly, I didn't get a warm reception from anybody. I think that everyone appreciated certain aspects of the process the way it was. I think when we did have, Mr. Brown can probably speak better to this, but you know, there were some issues when we did have combined meetings. They, I think our board members felt that there wasn't adequate time after the joint meetings to go through deliberations as they would have wanted to. The meetings went very long. You know, I'm not sure I agree with the notion that everything is just done in triplicate. I think, from my perspective and what I've seen and heard, admittedly not having, you know, Ms. Gardner's tenure, but you know, the meetings unfold a little bit differently. Someone from the Board of Ed, for example, said to me that, you know, we go before the Board of Selectmen and they kind of put us through the paces. When we come through the Board of Finance, we have an updated, better presentation because we know what to expect. We've got better information, and you know, we feel like we're better anticipating questions, and it's also forced us to be thoughtful about what we need to get across. And you know, and I don't see the same things happening at every meeting. I see different things happening through the different bodies. That's, again, just my perspective. You know, and I would also say that as much as you know, if you're management, these meetings can be a pain in the neck. You know, again, having been through it, whenever I had to personally prepare for a board meeting, you know, it forces you to go through a process and, you know, make sure that you can tell your story and make sure that you can explain how you're accountable. And I think there's value in that. You know, I think that most of the time that's probably spent on these budgets happens well before they ever get to any bodies, because, you know, the departments have to go through and pull together their plans and what they're going to do. So, you know, that's just a different perspective I would offer. And again, I would always believe that there are process improvements that could be made, but mandating joint meetings is something that I personally don't think is wise. I think our charter currently gives the option to do that. And if circumstances require that, or if members feel that that's appropriate under a given set of circumstances, I think that's a good option to have. You know, I personally wouldn't change the charter from that perspective. So I know that's a lot, and I'll take a breath now, but I don't know if you want to hear from Mr. Brown, or if not, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, I think it's a lot, but it's all very helpful, and I appreciate it. Thank you. We're going to wait for questions. I do have some, and you've raised a lot of good points, and I'm sure the others do as well. But I think we are going to move on through the other speakers and then kind of have more of a panel discussion, if you will. So thank you. Mr. Brown.
Yes, thank you. So I'll begin this way. When I was I did have the opportunity to go through both processes, the one Ms. Gardner outlined with joint meetings, and most recently where we have these separate meetings. And admittedly, they both have their advantages. However, here are my thoughts on it. So currently, we have a $330 million budget, and it's pretty complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. You have the Board of Ed, you have the town, you have these operating expenses, you have wages, but then you have wage reserves, so you have contingency. You have your long-term obligations like fund balance, you have debt service, you have retirement benefits, then you have your grand lists, then you have the Board of Assessment Appeals, you have your total expenses, you have your revenues, you have your non-tax revenues, and then finally, you get to your mill rate. And so it's a very thorough process, but it's a very thorough, detailed, complicated budget. So we need the proper time to make decisions. And one of the advantages of the way we do this now is every board has new information and more updated information from the previous board once they voted. And so the 3 months that this takes is in many ways well worth it, because every elected official is going to make the best decision what they feel for the town. So they're going to want this information. So the process, obviously, it cannot be rushed. Also, and I was talking to who was the vice chair, Chris DeWitt, earlier about this process. And, you know, we agreed as we looked at it, each board, the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, and then the RTM, they all have a slightly different perspective on how they look at the budget. Right, the Board of Selectmen is going to have more of an executive view, a leadership view. What do I want to accomplish? What do I want to get done this budget season, this fiscal year? The Board of Finance is going to look at this from a financial perspective. We're going to look at our long-term obligations, our bonding, our debt service, our fund balance, our retirement investment, short-term, long-term. What decisions are we making today that will affect tomorrow? The RTM, they may look at this from a legislative perspective. How is this going to affect my district? What am I hearing from my community? What about the school system that is in my district? And so then it all comes together. So there's checks and balances, as there should be, as the process moves through, as the budget moves through the process. So I would say this, that, you know, we're a town RTM type government, and the process that we have now for this type of government works. Now, when we had joint sessions, the Board of Finance and the Board of Selectmen, I mean, they were fine. It wasn't a competitive nature. I never felt that I was competing against the Board of Selectmen. You know, everyone had time to ask their questions and answer the questions, and that the meetings were okay. Maybe they were a little bit long, but that's what you sign up for. The difficult part was the time the Board of Finance, at least for me, had from the time the Board of Selectmen voted to when the Board of Finance was going to vote, which was a matter of days. And so what this process does is it allows a month to go by. It allows more information. It allows the Board of Finance, from the time the Board of Selectmen votes, to take a look at what might be the Board of Finance's priorities and how does that fit and work with what perhaps the Board of Selectmen's priorities are. It gives us time. And then the RTM has a month, not only to get new information, but to take a look at the recommended budget from the Board of Finance and make their own decisions. So for me, there is repetitiveness. I get it. The department heads have to come up, make presentations 3 to 4 times. They are answering a lot of the same questions. I mean, we can get into the weeds as boards. I mean, I have seen that, but overall, we're trying to take a look at the budget in a more or less at a level where we think the priorities are being met. So that's what I would say about the process. If we're going to have this type of government, I believe this process works. As far as the capital budget, as Lori was discussing, you know, we have bonding policies, we have our debt service policies as a board, and we have our waterfall. I agree that needs to be tightened up in some way. I think that can get a little messy. It's not real consistent from one year to the next. So there's work that we can do there. So I hope I answered, your question, or if anybody has any thoughts or questions for me, I'll be glad to listen.
I'm sure there will be, and I appreciate your overview and thoughts on the process as well. So last but not least, we will hear from the RTM moderator, Mr. McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Caffarelli. I really don't have to speak now because Lori and Jim did it for me. Thank you very much. No, I agree with a lot of what they said, the capital budget part, and I think the system works well today with the current form of government we have. I think the way the budget deliberations go, I think it depends on what the balance of power is in each of the bodies, the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, and the RTM, and the Board of Ed. You know, when you look at it, you could have the selectman could be from one party, and the first select person could be from one party, and the two select persons could be from the same party, and the first select person may not be able to get their priorities in place for that coming budget year. And then the same things could happen along down the line. The repetitiveness, I think, can be a little bit of a problem, I'm sure, for the administration and the management. What I find for myself, I won't speak for everybody, but I think the RTM needs to prepare themselves, because, you know, even I admittedly, I get frustrated when I hear somebody ask a question that's already been asked in the Board of Selectmen meeting, and it was asked in the Board of Finance meeting, because they're not necessarily, I watch the Board of Selectmen meeting for the budget, I watch the Board of Finance meetings for the budget. So by the time it gets to us, I'm prepared with maybe some different questions or a different slant to some of those questions, but not asking the same questions. And I don't think everybody necessarily does that. I mean, there are a lot of meetings, right? This is our second meeting for some of us, 2 nights in a row here that we've attended. So I find that one thing being the prepared part of the whole equation. As you all know, you know, we're kind of like the, we're kind of like the buzzard in the desert to picking over the what's left of the body, right? You know, the little bits and pieces. I don't know. I watch a lot of these, you know, Alaska shows, you know, and they always leave the insides for the, you know, the whoever the bear to come pick up, or the, you know, the inside of the moose. So, you know, sometimes I feel like that's what the RTM has left to look at, and it's always also, you know, there's always these. What's one thing we always talk about? Paving, right? It's always paving. It's always emails from constituents about the BOE in schools, the library. It's the same things. It's a consistent theme every single year that happens. And the Board of Finance and the Board of Selectmen get the same type of emails and such. But like I said, all we can do now is reduce. Unless there's an appeal, we can only reduce. So what's left at the end? I've heard people talk about, you know, $75,000 is, you know, is nothing. But if you take, you know, 10 $75,000 items, you're up to $750,000. or $100,000 items, you're up to $1 million. You can get some reductions that way. And I don't think you need to put things together to get those numbers to make sense. A one-off $75,000 item might not mean much. It's pennies, right? It's 0.000 whatever in your taxes. So I think I like the way the process works. We have scaled it down now where we have 2 nights of meetings scheduled, and that's what we've usually had for the last few years. And basically, we don't have every department come. Obviously, we're going to have the Board of Ed come, but we don't have every department come from each of from the town. So that's really about all I can think of right about now, but that's where I stand. I don't think I have anything else right now. So any questions? Sure.
Well, thank you. I think what I would do is then open it up to the commission members to begin some questions. Mr. Rottola.
Thank you, John Mottola. So the first question or comment I would ask Steve to look at this. I thought I saw in some of the material that some towns do have in their charters capital budget requirements. Is that correct?
That is correct. I was going to, while we're there, Mr. Commissioner, if you look at the document and you follow the chart, the comparative charts and the footnotes at the back of the document, you will see the town's, some of the actual provisions with respect to the capital and general fund budgets. So I think most of the other towns we compared you to do have a coordinated capital and general fund budget that kind of runs simultaneously.
Okay, so and I saw that, but so the language is in there somewhere if I look at it?
There would be language. I didn't go deeply into it because because I wanted some direction to make sure that you wanted to go in the direction of introducing a capital budget. But I do have the general language from other charters in this document right now. What is not in this document are the contents of a capital budget. What should be in a capital budget? And actually, your charter doesn't even have what are the contents of the general fund budget. And I thought that would be an issue that we might discuss as well.
All right. I'd like, to the extent that there's language, and just point it out to us and at some point, or email it to us so we can take a look at it. So I just did, just for the benefit of the members of this commission, the Board of Finance does have a budget committee that every year looks at the budget process and how we as a board can make that process better. So I think it's important that the members of this commission realize that. And Mr. DeWitt, who's the Board of Finance member, generally heads that committee. I think he's been in charge of that committee for at least 6 years or so. And he makes recommendations about how we as a Board of Finance can improve our process. I'd also, just for the record, the language that Linda cited to, can we just make sure we get that? And so I can take a look at it. I wrote it down really fast, but I want to make sure what we have is accurate. And then on the RTM, Mark, your comment that some RTM members, and you get frustrated, will ask questions that had been asked at previous meetings, and that can be a little frustrating. Has the RTM, and maybe this is more of a process question too, and maybe it shouldn't be even considered here, but I'm just going to throw it out anyway. Has the RTM considered having a finance committee, budget committee, that is the committee charged with, watching all the previous budget meetings, and then when the budget is presented to the RTM, it's the committee that leads with the questioning and maybe to streamline it that way a little bit more. Obviously, with the other RTM members can watch that meeting, and submit questions maybe through your committee. That's just a thought, because when I was on the RTM several years ago, and Tam's raising her hand too, I remember we did have certain committees that would hear specific departments with respect to their budget. So that's just a thought, and I'd love to hear from Pam and Mark on this.
Yeah, I neglected to mention, I think, we have 5 committees on the RTM, right? So with 8 members each, and I think overall they should be more involved and engaged in budgeting and also in whatever meetings that these other, the Recreation Commission has, the BOE, whatever. Like take for instance, you have the Board of Ed and the Ed and Rec Commission. So that's the Board of Ed and then our Recreation. So that's a lot of stuff there, right? And a lot of stuff going on. And then you have Public Health and Safety and DPW Finance and L&A, right? So yeah, I think I agree. We have not had one. Pam can, since I've been on the RTM, I don't know of any, like one specific committee that's been put together to look at or say, hey, we got to watch these meetings and report back kind of thing. Pam can maybe chime in as well. I haven't seen it in my 6 years.
So, yeah, to answer your question, John, yes, that's actually how the RTM rules are set up to work. That's the RTM rules to regulate specifically say. However, what they say and how we operate are 2 entirely different things. And we streamlined things back at the RTM in 2014 because each committee was hearing presentations on the agenda separately. So only certain items were going to L&A, that was probably how it was when you were on it, John. Only certain items were going to Parks and Rec, or Ed and Rec, and et cetera, et cetera. What was happening was then, because the entire RTM had to vote on those same items, when we came back together as a whole body, we spent the whole night repeating the entire committee process, and because the one group didn't know what the other group had heard and what this group had heard, and then it just became completely ineffective, meeting on 2 separate nights, and we tried to combine that, and that worked really well from a presentation standpoint, and the fact that then everybody got to hear the same information, they got to hear all the questions that were asked and answered. But what sort of got watered down then in that process was that it really now has no relevancy whatsoever what committee you're on unless you're on L&A, because L&A is the only committee that does work outside of a regular RTM meeting, and that's to deal with ordinances. I tried when I was moderator, and I was the one who combined all this stuff because it wasn't working. But what I tried to do when I was the moderator was to still have those folks engaged in working on those sections of their budget and having questions go through them, but nobody wanted to do it. Everybody wanted to have everything. They wanted to send their thing, they wanted to get their answer, and they didn't want to go through, Carol Way, who was the chairman of the Ed and Rec at the time. And so it just didn't work, and this ties back to my experience as the body being too big. And it really, I really think that we need to consider having a smaller body. And you have 8 people on the committee. Mark's absolutely right. Those are the folks that should be going to the Parks and Rec Commission meetings. They should be engaged. They should know their budget just as well as you know, the Parks and Rec commissioners, and when those items come up, they should be able to speak to them, they should be able to report on them. There are a lot of things that we can be doing in that regard, but you've got 8 people on this thing and you just don't have 8 people that are engaged in doing that. Then what happens is you have maybe one and somebody else will tag along, and I tried to send somebody to, I remember this very specifically, somebody from the Ed and Rec to something at the museum, and it was the chair who was a Republican who gave a report, and then everyone said that was biased because it wasn't a whole group thing. So to answer your question, yeah, we've had that. Yes, that's how it should work, but it didn't work. It didn't work. So, and I know there's other towns that use their committee systems very effectively, but you have to have a group that has the, I don't know what the right word is, you know, the willingness to understand that they're not on that particular committee, and then they don't have, it just doesn't work like that. So
you have to have,
the tradition, I guess, is I want to say.
Yeah, you have to have, you know, in Bridgeport with, like, what are they, about 30 or so council people, they have committees, and the committees do the work, and if they voted an item and they're unanimous on it, it goes on the city council consent calendar.
See, and that was the problem. Yeah, and we weren't getting consent calendars, and yep, you're absolutely right. I do not disagree with you in the least.
Yeah, I mean, it's a process that needs to be looked at. I'm not sure it can be looked at in the charter, unfortunately, but I won't go there right now. But that's all I have. I didn't mean to ask too many questions. Thank you.
I agree, John, and I thank you. I mean, we have on occasion had committees report on certain things that are going on at, say, you know, I guess, and what was it, last year or 2 years ago, to make it look bipartisan, I guess, right? So nobody's saying it's, you know, myself and Chrissy Kelly gave a combined report about something that was going on in the education. So, you know, more of that.
Perfect example.
More of that, more involvement, direct involvement with the committees in, you know, wherever they need to be. You know, and even with that, even the Ed and Rec, maybe that should be even split up, because it's, you know, that's kind of a behemoth in itself. You know, you have let's say, okay, the Rec department is actually a revenue generator, right? More than anything else. And then the education department, obviously, you know, Board of Ed is not really, but yeah, I think Mr. Medic has a question. Not that I'm moderating now, sorry.
Yeah.
You do your job very well, Mr. Moderator.
Yeah, you do.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Please, go ahead.
Just going back to the colloquy between our member of the Board of Finance and a member of the RTM who are on the commission, I think we can address structural issues. You know, as not to jump the gun, but we're going to be moving on in the next few weeks to government structure. And government structure doesn't necessarily mean that we're looking at a change, that we're looking to move to a different form of government. We're going to take a look at what we have, what's out there, and what things can be done to improve our government, whether it's the size of the RTM, whether it's the processes at the RTM or the processes at the Board of Finance or the Board of Selectmen. So I think we can look at some of those issues. So we will probably bring the moderator and other members of the RTM into the discussion at some point as you begin to look at process. So I wouldn't say that you can't affect the process. And if you think it's a constitutionally important principle to establish a committee structure, and they do work. In many places, they do work. They work in Bridgeport, they work in New Haven, they work in some smaller communities as well. It's not a big city thing because it doesn't work in some of the big cities I'm working with right now. We have some serious problems with our committees. But to make it work, you need to accept the fact that you can't be everywhere. That if you get on a committee, that's your job. And it's your colleagues' job to listen to the work that comes out of the committees. And the committees are bipartisan, the bodies are bipartisan, and it's up to the body to rely on the leadership of a committee. That's the sign of a mature legislative body. And there might be things we could do in this charter to look at that issue and address it.
Thank you. Just to follow, because I find the current structure where our meetings, we have and I know Jared will not like this because he has to have stuff there a week earlier than he really wants to, but you know, I like the structure of the way we meet as an RTM. We have our committee meetings, you know, we separate out after we have all our presentations, we vote so we can get to a consent calendar. And then we have our full meeting the following week, and everything gets voted on, and you know, we move on to the next thing. So
Okay, I think John Wynn had a question or comment.
I do. First, thank you, John Wynn here. Thank you all for your thoughtful comments on each of the roles that you play currently or formerly played. Some very thoughtful, insightful comments there. I'd like to talk a little bit about the related to the capital planning meeting that Ms. Charlton mentioned from last evening. And you know, it's recognized if you observe that meeting that there's a big appetite for spending and projects and things like that. But there's a limiting control with our policy regarding the level of bonding we can initiate, which helps us moderate that big appetite that the town has for spending. So I'd like to kind of bridge from that good structural control to a question from a budget standpoint of doing a budget from a bottoms up versus you know, plus minus delta approach from the existing budget. The two different approaches from personal experience in the corporate world for a long time, and from looking at the government finance offices, best practices and leading practices. You know, sometimes a different approach and kind of zero-based budgeting or from the bottoms up helps establish spending control, because people don't just build upon where they are. They have to justify the work, the request for funding that they have. So with that as an approach to think about from a budgeting standpoint, would a spending limit like COLA for town operations be something to consider as part of a budget process? And would strong spending guidance to the Board of Ed be something else to consider? I recognize that the town can't direct what the Board of Ed spends on money, yet it can establish some parameters for what they should come forward with in the way of spending requests in their budget. So I kind of put these couple of different ideas, building upon the well-established capital planning approach of putting in budget structure to help the town stop itself from becoming unaffordable. So I'm curious about people's perspective on that.
Jim Brown, first a couple of things and I'll come back to what you said. Is it John? Is it John?
Yes.
I'll come back to what John said in a second. And to what Steve said is, I'm all for taking a look at this structure. But the way we're designed now is we have elected officials. What we need to do is find a way to get the information we need to make the proper vote and figure out a way to streamline what we're doing. And those are two things I think with the thoughts that you just put out can be done. One of the challenges with what I just heard is, sure, we could say we're going to have a COLA, but how is that going to work practically? If we say to the Board of Ed, we're going to allow you 2.5% a year, how do we enforce that? That would be my question. I mean, if I'm understanding your statement correctly.
Well, I actually had suggested a COLA limit for town operations and strong spending guidance to the Board of Ed. Now, you could say it's a limit to the Board of Ed. I truthfully don't know the exact way it would work, except that the Board of Ed would need to figure out what's programs are most critically important to achieve the educational objectives they have and allocate their funding to accomplish that. And I know it's not easy and it's a simplistic thought. So I'm curious how that could be done. Is it done anyplace else? How does it work? What are the positive aspects of it? What are the downfalls of it?
There, at one point, and I believe Pam was on the Board of Ed at the time, the Board of Ed had set guidelines, Pam, correct me if I'm wrong, to the Board of Ed administration and said, you know what, 2% a year. This is what we want you to strive for, 2% a year. And I think you did put those guidelines in. So I think there is some past history to what you're suggesting. But then the question is, how do you enforce it and how would that work? But Pam, am I right in that?
Yeah, when Dr. Title was there, we sort of gave guidance of where we wanted to land, but we did that as a board. You know, the board had to collectively give him that feedback.
And then as far as the town goes on COLA, I think that currently the board's push for that right now. You don't see the town budgets going up or increasing as you know, in substantial, significantly year over year. And if one department happens to, there's usually an explanation. But there was something in that document, one of the documents, the GFOA, that did give a best practice about how to approach this budget, which was to kind of a bottom-up approach, basically to start all over, forget about last year, a bottom-up approach, and justify it year after year, and not just take a look at last year and kind of add on to it. Am I right, Steve? And I kind of like that idea or that thought as a budget process.
John, did you have a follow-up?
That tends to be an administrative decision. I can't think of a charter that mandates that that approach. But I could take a look at that and talk to a couple of folks on that. You want to be careful about what you want to be careful about in the charter. You want to establish processes in the charter. You want to be very careful about taking something that sounds like a good policy today and placing it in the charter that is your constitution and that is not so easy to change. You know, if you want to establish an ordinance on a bottoms-up approach, you know, in that way, you can. If you want to establish principles in your charter that are fiscally responsible or you know, that really address looking at economies of scale, et cetera, you can use broad terminology that would lead the policymakers in the direction of what Commissioner Wynn and Chairman Brown are talking about, and that is trying to come up with a policy that makes sense this year or next year, but may require change 3 years from now or 4 years from now. But you don't want to lock yourself into an economic policy in your charter. And so maybe lay out some broad principles in your charter in the budget section.
I think, Chairwoman Charlton, did you have something to add to this?
Yeah, I'll throw out, and I appreciate Mr. Wynn's comment. I think based on my personal experience, I think that's one of those things that sounds good, but I've literally never seen it done in practice. Any organization, they'll talk about it, but then when you're trying to put together a budget, almost inevitably, you know, you're going to get back to the starting point of where you are, because unless your function or your mission is fundamentally changing or being restructured, you know, your existing budget is based on the services you're providing or, you know, the things you're offering that have certain metrics attached to them. So if it's schools, it's going to be, enrollment and class sizes and things like that. And, you know, I've literally just never seen it. Maybe some company does it as a best practice. You know, the GFOA, I know, mentions that that's a best practice. I've never actually seen it done. Because, you know, even if it's stated as a principle, you know, to literally go through a process where you just sort of throw away what you have and disregard kind of your current employee base and what you do, it just doesn't really happen. So that's just my personal opinion. I think it would be interesting if we know any municipality or organization that does that. It would be interesting to really understand the fundamentals of how they approach it, because I just really haven't seen that operationalized. I personally do not believe that having a COLA cap in our charter is the right idea. I do understand where you're coming from, and I agree with what Mr. Brown said. I think if we, you know, I know there's always a lot of tension between spending, the Board of Ed and the town and who's doing what. I don't think we've had a recent history of egregious tax increases. I think regardless of how the process works, it's been my observation that our chief executive and the boards usually do in fact look, you know, top down from the standpoint of, you know, what's a tolerable increase in the mill rate? What's a tolerable increase in taxes? And so they tend to manage to something that I think has been, you know, pretty close to the rate of inflation over, you know, in recent memory. You know, last year was an exception, but last year was sort of, you know, we got a 2-year increase all at once. So, you know, that's what I would offer. And I also want to circle back on your comment on the, you know, capital budget, because you're right. The fact that we have that we try to stick to a limit in terms of debt service is an important control, I guess, in terms of the overall spending cap. But I don't believe that's what a capital budget would accomplish. I think a capital budget accomplishes much more than that. And in particular, the accountability, the tracking, the oversight of the dollars that are spent, which is just not there at the moment. And I'm not saying that internally it doesn't happen, you know, at the town, but from the standpoint of our elected bodies, it just doesn't happen at all. And so, you know, I think that discipline, again, in my opinion, is sorely needed, not just from a standpoint of establishing, you know, a spending limit, but more from establishing a level of accountability and transparency into what happens with these large, oftentimes multi-year projects after an initial approval is given. So thank you.
Steve?
Yeah, the chair just made Chair Charlton, there's several chairs here. Charlton just made, since we're being so polite and formal, some very, very good points. And one of the points that I was going to make, if it hadn't come up tonight, and I'm glad it did come up tonight, was the need to take a look at capital. And one of the things the capital budget does is capital budgets are usually planned so that you can look back and look forward. And the concept of laying out your budget so that you can see how the items have been spent and how the revenue, you know, and where they've been spent from year to year does make a great deal of sense. The other thing that she just mentioned in this last comment that she made that I want to talk about a little bit, and if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, I will raise a question. You would ask me if I wanted to talk about some other practices in other communities, and this may be a good jumping off point. I want to step on any of the other commissioners if they have questions. I'll just raise a couple of points here, and then I'll go back to we'll go back to regular order. Chair Charlton talked about services and that you're looking at planning your budget based on services, but you also plan a budget based on a lot of things. Collective bargaining agreements, something you don't have any control over, except every few years when you negotiate your collective bargaining agreement. You have your debt obligations, your long-term debt, your bonded debt, all the things that are sitting out there that the community has to pay attention to. So it's very, very difficult to strip down and start from scratch on a regular basis. And then you also have within the collective bargaining agreements, not just the monetary elements of the collective bargaining agreement, but the work that is permitted by employees under collective bargaining agreements. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask everybody, and I did talk about this briefly, let me just make a point. I think in the private conversations I had with the speakers, I think I said the same thing to all the speakers, and that is, I'm not going to try to tell you what you should do if things are working, and if you feel comfortable that things are working. But one of the things I saw missing in this charter was more content and direction on what content should be in the budget. And so if maybe some of you could address how we determine the content of the budget. Is there an ordinance? And I've not done the research beyond looking at the charter itself. I've not gone in there. Or is it just adopted as a matter of policy? Do you, in your charter, in your budget, point out the drivers of the budget, so the members of the public? Well, let's start here. The members of the Board of Finance first, the members of the RTM second, members of the public third, know what the drivers are. If there's a lot of overtime in a budget, is that budget based on what Chair Charlton said, service, or was it based on a contract obligation to an employee group? In many communities, it tends to be police and fire that are the big drivers of overtime in communities. And so my question to everybody on the panel and for the commission to consider is, should there be more content in the charter, content requirement in the charter? And should there be requirements in the charter for disclosure of some of the things that in narrative form that drive items in the budget? The example I used was collective bargaining agreement. It could be other things as well. So that would be my kind of observation and question in one at the same time. So I would ask the panelists if they could answer that.
Thank you, and thank you for weighing in on those matters, Steve. I appreciate that. It raises a good point. I think Jared has his hand up if I see that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mednick, for the question. To answer your specific question about budget drivers, we do include information in there. It's not, there's no obligation or mandate that I'm aware of that requires us to do that. So it's not part of the charter, but we do it. I don't know if that's been going on forever, but that is done now. You also touched on a point, Mr. Mednick, about the what I would call the fixed costs that are in the budget and what those and to me that's what makes it most difficult to put in some kind of cap on the budget, because you either have to make an exemption or an exception for those things, and I can by the time you make the exceptions for those things that are for the most part out of our control or negotiated, there's not a whole lot left. And what will end up happening if you don't make exceptions is you end up squeezing some other parts of the budget and having to reduce other parts of the budget to get it down to a point where to meet whatever the required spending limit is. And so there are definitely unintended consequences of doing things like that. And as far as, and I'm going to go back a little bit here, but the zero-based budgeting, and I had some experience in talking about this at the state level, there is a ton of work required to do zero-based budgeting, because a lot of it revolves around metrics and having to put in the, either hire someone from outside or hire internally, and to create the metrics and to every year, you know, to work out the metrics to know whether or not it's what you're doing, the number of people that you have in each facet of government works, whether it's appropriate based on some benchmarks. It requires a lot of work on that end. On the capital discussion about capital, I think what last night in particular shined a light on was the need for a more robust conversation and collaboration, and not just between the administration and education, but also the boards to come up with what the priorities are, because we're at it for whatever reason. For whatever the reason is, last night the dollar amount of the projects was very large compared to years past, and I can only speak from the administration side of things, and the idea was to be transparent and to put on the table all the projects that are out there that we're aware of, and then to treat it like a workshop and go through and figure out which ones are the priority. And so that's why the first selectwoman offered up the idea of creating some kind of working group to take all the projects that are out there, the whole, if you want to call it a wish list, and to narrow those down into a smaller number that will fit within the guides and kind of the roadmap that we established with the bonding capacity analysis that we started doing last year, and keeping things within that amount. And then, one other thing that I wanted to mention, because I think everybody has touched on it, and I appreciate everybody's understanding, acknowledgement that there is repetition in the process. And I think the moderator talked about sometimes the repetitive questions. The other thing, let's face it, there's politics in these meetings, and that's the other thing that gets redundant. And so, the more meetings you have, the more politics that there's going to be in the questioning and the responding, and so that's just another aspect of it that I think needs to be considered as well.
Pam? Oh, it looks like Jim Baldwin after Pam.
I just had some questions following up on the earlier discussion. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about dates and get thoughts maybe from administration and some of the other members of the panel about the dates that we follow now, like what the first Monday in May. Obviously, you got to figure out the mill rate, and you have to get your tax bill out, and there's probably some correlation to that relating to the July 1st fiscal year, and then how it all gets backed up between there. Is there enough time to assemble all of this, or is this the right timeline we should be following? Is it too long? Is it too short? A recurring theme in this conversation was we keep getting new information along the process. We keep getting new, and that's why it's good that it goes to the Board of Selectmen, and then it's good that it goes to the Board of Finance, and then it's good because we get new information. But can we just, playing devil's advocate, all hear it later with the most relevant information closest to the date that it has to pass, rather than guessing again, and then getting it and making it happen? So I'd be interested to know about the timeline. And then also specifically, and we probably should have had somebody here, and I didn't think about it until this very moment, but in regards to the Board of Ed budget and when they hand that over, you know, because it came out in discussions earlier that administration has Board of Education needs to be doing more than they're doing when they're handing over their budget to us, and you know, from a planning perspective, does that need to be addressed in the charter, or you know, are you getting everything that you need in a time that you need to get it, I guess is my long-winded question here.
Yeah, well, there's a couple questions, so let's kind of parse them out. So maybe if we could take them in turn. So the first one, I believe, and I don't want to misstate, but is there a mechanism by which we could get all the information at a later date that's all up to date so that it doesn't have to be guessing along the way? And I think that's probably most appropriate to be answered first by the Jared Linda team, if you care to weigh in on that.
So I'll say that there's, you know, that month between the time that the Board of Finance votes and then the RTM and the RTM votes, there may be a little too much time in there, and maybe you could collapse that time a little bit and maybe the process starts a little bit later. That, you know, that's my opinion of that. And because I do think the May date is not a bad one. You know, there are a number of things that it still gives us enough time to get you know, as long as everything is done fairly quickly after that, and there aren't a lot of things holding up the process after that, you know, still gives us enough time to calculate and issue tax bills, and so that, you know, so I think as far as the final adoption, I don't see a problem with that. But like I said, I only have 1 year of experience doing this, and so my feeling was that there was a lot of time during the time between the Board of Finance and the RTM that time could probably be condensed some. Also, I think the May is a good time because we're more likely to get, you know, and they don't typically play a huge role, but they do play a role. You know, the numbers from the state and the state adopting its budget, and you know, knowing what those numbers are, and frankly any of the other numbers, especially on the revenue side, where we're trying to get a better handle on what those are going to be. So I don't think I would bump I'm not sure I would advocate for moving to May 1st time, but I might, you know, I might be interested in considering pushing it, starting the process a little bit later, with the exception of the Board of Education. There's not a lot of discussion with them before they finalize their budget.
That's why I don't mean to interrupt you, Jared, but that's why I wonder if there's room in there to allow for more time to have that consensus building between for the Board of Ed and the town. You know, instead of having to have the first selectwoman have her budget in on March 1st, is there room in there to move that to March 15th or pick a date? You know, is that advantageous to you, or it doesn't make a difference?
So I do think I think it is advantageous. Of course, who knows? You know, habits may just develop. You know, from there when it comes to the timing of when we get the information from the Board of Education. Maybe, you know, maybe they are just slow and they react to the later date. But you know, I'll say honestly, part of that's on us too, to open up that conversation, and we did actually do that this year. I submitted a letter to the superintendent to request a meeting earlier so that we could have those conversations and start that dialogue about the budget earlier, so that we can, we have our input and can make suggestions. But I agree. I think that, starting, whether it's 15 days or something like that later, that I think that would be helpful.
Okay. Steve,
Thank
I know Jim has a comment, and Steve.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll defer to Jim.
So Jim, and I know we probably have some follow-up questions, but let's hear from Attorney Baldwin, and then let's refocus this on kind of charter-related items on the budget. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a brief comment to make. It's an observation, and it kind of fits in with what Ms. Gardner and Mr. Schmidt were talking about in terms of streamlining the meetings, and along the same lines of what Ms. Gardner suggested, I would submit that you might consider getting rid of altogether the need to have the Board of Selectmen vote on the budget, insofar as each member of the Board of Selectmen is already an ex officio member of the Board of Finance, and therefore that would build in their ability in a more natural sense to participate in the budget process jointly with the Board of Finance, even though they wouldn't necessarily have a vote, although that could be a charter change. But they nevertheless, whatever they pass on to the Board of Finance is subject to the Board of Finance's ultimate decision on what that budget is actually going to look like. So I just throw that out there for this body to consider as an alternative.
Okay, Steve?
Yeah, if I may, I think that the town attorney just made a very prescient remark. What you may not realize is that the form of government you have structurally is really a form of government that's a leftover from your special act. Because in Connecticut, under the chief executive, the rubric of what you can have as a chief executive officer, the concept of a board of selectmen as a chief executive officer is not there. So that in most selectmen towns, you have a first selectman who is the chief executive officer and submits the budget, then to the Board of Finance, and it moves on to the RTM from that point, and then if there's a referendum, to a referendum by petition. So that what the town attorney is suggesting is more consistent with the model of government that exists, where the chief executive would submit the budget, and then the first deliberative process. And I'm assuming that in this form of government, whether there's a vote or not, I can't imagine the first select woman wouldn't be dealing with the members of the Board of Selectmen as the budget moves on. So you might be able to do that, and that would be one approach to take. I wanted to say two other things to Commissioner Icone's comment about the Board of Ed. You can, in your charter, set a date for the submission of department budgets to the first select woman, so that you can have a locked-in date, or at least have in the charter a requirement to lock in a date, so that all departments have to get their budget information into the administration by a date certain. So you can leave yourself some flexibility to establish by policy or ordinance, or actually fix the date in the charter. And the Board of Education, like any other department, and that's all they are. We'll have discussions about that if you want at some point. They are a department. They have their own elected board of directors. I get it, but they are a department, and under law in the state of Connecticut, they have to comply with procedural requirements of the town. So you can set a firm date to require them to put that in there, and you can do that in the charter. My guess, the last point I'll make, is I want to try to help you with the legal aspects of some of the comments you're making. My guess is that the reason you have that May date has nothing to do with tax collection, because in most of the towns I deal with, the bigger cities tend to push their budgets into the end of May or early June. If they don't have a referendum, as John Mottola will tell you in Bridgeport, there's no referendum. In New Haven, there's no referendum. Waterbury, Hartford. They will push it as far as they can. And they're starting to push out further because they'd like to know what the legislature has done. And a lot of the larger cities would like to push their final budget decisions until the second week in June, so that they can really have a sense of what the budget looks like in the long session of the legislature. My guess is that you have a May date because you have the petition for overrule. You have a referendum possibility. And so I think that the May date probably builds in the extra time that would take you into the beginning of June if there ultimately was a referendum. And so one of the things you probably have to think about is, I don't know when the last time you had a referendum on the budget was. You might consider extending your time a little bit. If you haven't had them historically, you might want to extend it if you need the extra time during the budget season to formulate the budget. But my guess is that all the communities that I looked at are RTM communities, and they're all operating with overrule petitions. It's another way of saying a referendum, but it's not an automatic referendum. And so very often you're done at the beginning of May, and you actually might benefit from a little additional time, even in the short session, of knowing what's going to be. Or it's a biennial budget, so it's not as critical. But the more information you get from the state, better off you are in formulating your budget. So, but that's my guess is the reason you have an early May date.
I think John Mottola raised a question in the chat about, John.
Yeah, I think I wasn't going to go there, but we have, under state law, we have to have a budget by a date certain, right, Steve?
You have to have your budget in effect for July 1. There's no statutory date for the adoption of a budget, but you want to have a budget in place for the beginning of the fiscal year. And some towns with referenda, some of the old-fashioned town meeting towns, sometimes don't get their budgets done until July or August or September or even October, I've seen. And but you want to have your budget in effect for July 1. But there's no law that says your budget needs to be completed by a certain date.
I'm not saying we would do away with this, but I'm just kind of curious. Do we have to have a referendum procedure in our charter?
No. You have, but what you have in your charter is not a pure referendum. You have a petition, what I call a petition for overrule.
You don't have to have that.
No.
Okay.
No.
And just to clarify what you said a couple minutes earlier, so you're saying that in most towns that have a board of selectmen, the first select person does his or her budget, but doesn't submit it to the board of selectmen. It goes directly to the board of finance.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you've set up in your charter a chief executive officer under the current state statutes, under 7-193A2, for chief executive officers, the model is that you could have a mayor, you could have a first selectman, you could have a burgess in a borough. You could have a chief administrative officer appointed by a board of selectmen, which in effect operates as your legislative body for those purposes, or a town manager. But there's no board of selectmen as the chief executive officer. That's the point I was making. So there's other communities like Fairfield that have the same system you have, but I'm assuming, and I would hope, that they're all derived from their special acts. Otherwise, they're not operating in accord with state statute. But under the pure chief executive officer function, the first select woman would make the budget presentation to the Board of Finance.
So on that, did you have a follow-up, John?
No. So and I thought our charter said our first select woman is the chief executive officer of the town of Fairfield, right?
She has both the board. If you take a look at the charter, read it carefully, the Board of Selectmen is the executive.
Right.
The,
Okay.
the first select woman has individual executive functions, but as part of this executive body, although she has specific functions that are different than their functions. It's a combined it's a combined executive. It's not a singular executive system.
Gotcha. All right. All right. Thank you.
So that was what, so Pam, I want to just take a moment to ask a question that I've been wanting to bring up here, is that it's in line with what we've been talking about, and in terms of kind of the best practices and the best process, not necessarily for streamlining's sake, but the presentation to the Board of Selectmen. How can anybody here, I mean, maybe Linda, I've heard from, I think, Linda and Jim, that there have been times when there were joint meetings with the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance. And so I guess my question is why did that stop? And, kind of a sub part of that question is, when it is just the Board of Selectmen, the presentation, like, are there a lot of changes that happen after the Board of Selectmen presentation, or is it just more of a perfunctory type step in the process that might be looked at streamlining? So Linda, Jim, anyone else, whoever thinks that they've got some kind of knowledge on this, because that's why we're
Okay, I don't know why the joint meetings were discontinued, except there probably was a little political tension between the two boards, because what would typically happen is the meetings, I believe, went along swimmingly, and there was comedy between the two boards, and the information they received at the same time. But what happened is sometimes a member of the Board of Finance would come up with a great point like, wow, maybe we could reduce this by $600,000 because look at what I found. And by virtue of the Board of Selectmen going first, they would propose that cut for the $600,000 great idea that a member of the Board of Finance came up with. And then 2 days later, the Board of Finance would vote. And it appeared as if one body may be stealing the thunder from the other body. In terms of the information morphing, evolving, changing, that happens because we've started the process, we've had to back the process up so far that, for instance, our health insurance, we use 12 months of rolling health insurance experience to project our claims. Because we need to work those numbers up in the finance department, we may use claims experience as of December for the first selectman's budget and for the Board of Selectmen's budget. But by the time we get to the Board of Finance, 2 months later, we have 2 months more worth of claims experience that we will update for them. So it's not that the information necessarily gets better. It's just because the time horizon is so long, we can update the information. So it's not necessarily you're getting better, you are getting better information, but that's just a function of the timing. At one time, we had the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance doing the joint meetings. At another time, during the Jackie Durrell administration, I know this is going back far, we had the first selectman and the Board of Selectmen make the proposed budget together. But at that time, a decision was made that we wanted a stronger first select person form of government. And so that was split out so that the first select person could have more of an executive role. And since, I'm trying to think what year that was. It was during the Paul Audley administration. So if you could look that up in the records, I just don't have immediate recall. early 90s, I believe, we changed for that reason.
Okay. Jim, did you have any? I know you had referenced the 2 different times where.
Right. So as John Mottola mentioned, we have a budget committee that Chris DeWitt chairs, and there's 2 other Board of Finance members on that committee. And after each budget session, that committee goes and reports back to the Board of Finance what they think went well, what we can improve on, and what have you. So what that committee did was they went back and looked at the charter. And what we're doing now, the Board of Finance felt, is more in line with the charter. I don't remember talking about people stealing votes, so let's change the process. But, Linda it's the second time, Linda, you've mentioned that, so you know something I don't. But I just don't remember that discussion, coming up publicly anyway. So it was more in line with the charter, it was felt. And yes, the information, I would agree, I wouldn't call it's just more updated information. And also the Board of Finance, as I mentioned earlier, and the Board of Selectmen, have different roles, just like the RTM has a different role. And so the Board of Finance looks at this budget slightly different and has priorities. So I believe that's why it was changed. And as I mentioned earlier, it had to do with the timing. The Board of Finance wanted more time than the 3 or 4 days allocated after the Board of Selectmen voted to take another look at that budget and make their vote and do their deliberations.
So if the main driver in your eyes was that's what the charter read, if the charter were to change to read it's going to be a joint meeting, so you don't have that challenge any longer, would there still be, would it be a better process, or would it be, I'm hearing that maybe, having it reviewed 2 separate times will kind of vet it better. But maybe when you have those more minds together, the Board of Finance and Board of Selectmen, they kind of, spark ideas and questions for each other. So, there's kind of a flip side to it too, but I guess I'm just not hearing, we're trying to decide here whether or not the charter should be changed because the process could be improved. And I'm not really hearing an argument or a conclusion one way or the other.
Okay, I'll answer it this way. I can speak for myself. I am all for streamlining and trying to make this process more efficient, 100%. And if the structure changes and this commission finds a way to do that, I support it wholeheartedly. I heard 2 ideas tonight, kind of out of the box that I like. One was Mr. Baldwin's. I think it's an idea that deserves further consideration, and Ms. Iacano saying, okay, let's take a look at our dates, and can we push the dates back? So to me, it's just about the boards functioning as they should, having the information that they need, and running this as streamlined and as efficiently as possible. I think this charter does have obstacles to achieving those goals as it's currently written. And I think that this commission is important because I think it needs to be updated and looked at for new and better ideas. My point is that the boards are different. They have different priorities. The boards want their information. So let's find a way. And the department heads don't necessarily want to come out 4 times. So let's find a way that, we're in a position where everyone can win, and most especially the taxpayer and the residents.
I think, Pam, you had your hand up. Oh, I think it's Pam's. Do you have
No,
any-
if Lori wanted to add to that, because
Okay,
I just wanted
okay.
to follow back up on
Please.
all that. So if she has something to add to that, no problem, and then I can follow up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Lori?
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to follow up on what Mr. Brown just said. You know, I'm not going to dispute that somebody may have had some political view on something, as Ms. Gardner said, but I really, to answer your question fairly, I really do think it would be valuable to ask Mr. DeWitt that question, because as Mr. Brown indicated, he did in fact, he's chaired the budget committee for some number of years and has always been responsible for coming back after the fact and doing a postmortem to say, how do we do this better? And the charter, in my opinion, again, we looked at it again this year. I sort of polled everyone or almost everyone on the board and some others, was not viewed as the obstacle here, because the charter does in fact permit us to change the process. And so we had the option to take a vote and change the process to have joint meetings. And people didn't want to do that. And what I heard from most everyone who had been before was the point that Mr. Brown raised, and that was on the timing, that the board members felt that there was not adequate time for deliberations when the schedule of the joint meetings was in place. Now, that may have been a function of the timing of the joint meetings, or how much time there was in between. And so, I don't know that, but I do think there would be some value, because I think he could probably, be some value in asking Mr. DeWitt that question directly, because he, they did a lot of work to come up with that. And it wasn't just because that was what the charter suggested. We all understand that the charter gives us flexibility. I think the flexibility should remain, assuming we have a vote by the Board of Selectmen. And I just will say also that to Mr. Brown's point, the two ideas that were mentioned, I also agree with. On the better information question, I think it might be useful for you all to just get an understanding of what that actually means. In my recollection, there's a finite set of things that actually change. Ms. Gardner mentioned it's usually, health insurance, and, occasionally we'll get a slightly modified number from the actuary or whatever, but it's not like there are wholesale changes and everyone's getting new and better information throughout. It's a few things that change. And, quite frankly, even after those things change, many of them are still estimates. The Board of Education, for example, they may change, numbers on health insurance, which are a large part of the budget, but they're still estimating based on enrollment and teachers and a lot of other things. And, the final numbers that they come up with don't turn out to be the final numbers. So I think if the impetus for shifting the dates is to, compress this time frame in which better information will be available, I would just suggest, maybe looking back over the last couple of years and seeing how many of those items changed. In my memory, it's not very many. And, I'm not saying you don't want to compress the time frame, but that may or may not be the driver for why you wanted to do that. So thank you.
So if I could just follow up there, and thank you for that. But so if it required, so to get the most up-to-date information, if it required compressing the time, I'm hearing that it might be beneficial to have the meetings, at least with the Selectmen and Board of Finance together, because that way you don't have to go through those presentations twice, that you wait a little longer to get more up-to-date information, whatever it is. And then you have those meetings and then get it to the RTM, because something's got to give, right? If you compress the time. So, and again, I don't know, I hate to harp on it, but, we're looking at it just from kind of a mechanics process here of, what is in the charter and how, what should be changed, if anything, in terms of the process. Most of these things that we've discussed tonight, it sounds like, can be left to ordinances or internal processes, but in terms of this, in conjunction with, I think, and looking forward towards a top, discussion on governance itself, you know, if it's compressed, how do you see that happening? You know, other than you,
Yeah.
I hear and I agree that you don't want to streamline for streamline's sake. And that it seems as though you polled or talked to certain individuals who weren't in favor of this, but I'm not hearing, well, it would never work because
Right.
X.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I think that I'm not sure, and this is why you probably want to look at the changes that were made, that combining the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance on the current schedule would solve the problem. You know, I recall that things happen later, you know, the grand list changes come in, you know, late, that changes things, you know, so there were things that changed even after you know, the Board of Finance met. So, you know, it's a small list. I'm not sure that's a driver for combining meetings, unless everybody believes that's very important. And I'm not sure that shifting a date from, say, March 1st to March 15th would solve the problem. So again, just I would look at the details and what those changes have been, because I feel like some of them happened, you know, even later at a point where it would probably be too late to start, you know, and wait till everything was final. So that's my recollection.
Okay, I see. And Chris, the Vice Chair, Chris Brogan, I think, has a comment or question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, everybody, for the presentations. A couple of questions. The first one, maybe Steve or Jim can handle maybe later, but we've heard, obviously, that there've been joint meetings in the past, and then we had proposal for language to allow for joint meetings. I just want to make sure that the attorneys are confident that the current language allows joint meetings. I didn't see anything there that prohibited it, but if we, you know, if that's the route we decide to go, we want to make sure that either the current language allows it or we need to put additional language in to fix that.
Can I answer that for you, Steve?
Sure.
Chris, sorry. Jim Baldwin. Yeah, the current language most definitely allows for it, but it is solely with the approval. It's upon request by the Board of Selectmen to the Board of Finance, who makes the ultimate decision as to whether or not those joint meetings would be held. And the other, just while we're on the point, I just want to emphasize that what I mentioned is, in fact, not having a vote by the Board of Selectmen, to be clear. Therefore, it would really, I wouldn't call it a joint meeting of the Board of Finance. I would call it a meeting of the Board of Finance, which includes ex officio members of the Board of Selectmen. So to call it a joint meeting, I think is a misnomer. It's just that you're cutting out the official vote, the act of voting by the Board of Selectmen, and then you know, they are certainly encouraged to engage in those discussions with the Board of Finance, who has the vote after them regardless. So that's just my additional comment.
Okay, thanks. Next question is on an entirely different subject within this, which is there were comments earlier on about the assessment system under section 8.3D. Honestly, I didn't understand exactly what the problem was, but if there's anything we need to change in terms of the Board of Finance role in setting up an assessment system, I'd like to hear comments on that. As I said, it was brought up earlier, I think, in our public comments or on some government official comments. And if there's anything we need to look at there, I'd be interested in hearing about that.
This is Jim Baldwin again. I can comment on that. That's really language that is kind of ancient from the old special acts that spoke to the Board of Finance and their role. And since that language came about many, many years ago, it's really controlled by state statute, which requires a full on-property assessment every other time there is a revaluation. and allows for there to be a more, scientific, data-driven based assessment in the other 5-year program. And it's my view that that's what that language speaks to. It speaks to them coming up with how to assess the properties, when in fact, that's really kind of written in stone in one of those two formats. It doesn't mean that the Board of Finance does not have purview or oversight over the organization that's going to be doing it, or whether it's going to be one form or the other. I believe that they do, but I think that in summary, that language can be modified to bring it up to date with the current way that the actual assessment system works within the guidelines of the state statutes.
So it sounds like it's an issue of modernizing the language, not necessarily an issue with what's going on.
Steve, do you have any observations on that?
I was going to just associate myself with the remarks of the town attorney. I literally just addressed this issue 2 nights ago in Hartford, where they have an ancient provision very similar to this. They don't have a Board of Finance, but these almost served as enabling. It was really enabling legislation. Your special act enabled you to do things. We now have in the statutes the ability to do that without a provision like this, or we could modify this provision, because you don't need this language to enable the town to do this work.
Okay, we can work on that. And last question, there is a
before we move on.
Go ahead. Yep.
Chris, related to that point that you were just making, and Jim, I think we mentioned this earlier. One of the recent points of confusion on this was the use of the word system, and some people thought that word meant information technology system. And I think to clarify the language, that would indicate that the system is to represent policies, procedures, technology tools, oversight related to the appraisal process, I think would achieve the objective of clarifying what that is, and not just limiting the word system to the one technology tool we might use, but more about the Board of Finance role in the overall oversight of the fair and equitable establishment of property values for the town.
That Jim Baldwin here, that may run afoul of the state statutes, however, and that's why the statutes exist, because otherwise they were subject to what could be the political whims of a particular Board of Finance in a town, and the legislature thought it was better to not allow that to happen. I think that's exactly what the statutes are trying to avoid, quite frankly.
Okay, I'll go back and look at the statutes on that and see if there's something I might suggest that would clarify the wording to achieve clarity of purpose and not violate the intent of the statutes.
Okay. And I had
Chris,
one
did
other,
you have- yeah.
You had one other question, again, a comment, and I think this came from Mr. Flynn, and I'm sorry if I got the wrong person or the wrong quote, but I think there was a mention that there was some frustration in the Board of Finance, maybe that there wasn't as much control on the fee generation parts of the budget. I think mostly the use fees throughout the town. I don't know if that's an issue, and I don't know if it is an issue, if it's an issue for the charter or not, but does anybody have any comment on that? I think he's basically saying things like what's charged at the marina or whatever, or for the stickers, weren't controlled by the Board of Finance, but yet obviously they're responsible for the expenses. No.
Any thinkers on that one?
It's fine if it's not an issue for anybody. It was just a comment made.
Wasn't the issue, if I may I?
Yes, please,
Chair?
Steve. Yeah.
I thought the issue up. It might have been the first selectman who brought the issue up, that they don't have control over those fees. Those fees are set by other boards.
Right.
And the issue became a timing question, so that the charter can mandate that they set their fees in accordance with the budget schedule, so that if people have to get their budgets in, then those entities should get their fees in. So that,
I would think that would have to be part of their budget. That's why I didn't quite understand the way that, and in effect, the Board of Finance does control it since it can accept or reject the budget request.
yeah, so I think that if we want to be explicit in terms of what should be submitted as part of the budget, their fees for the year, if they're doing them in July, they should be doing them in January, so that they can put them into their budget for that year. That's the way I heard it when we got the testimony.
Then we had a hand. Oh, Pam.
The biggest fee generator that I could think of outside of the building department is Parks and Rec, and they do meet in time to get all of their fees adjusted to get it into the budget. I think what was being lamented there was that the Board of Finance is not the body that sets the fee structure specifically, and they, you know, but in that sense they can adjust revenue lines and such, but they can't, they have no say over how much we charge things and for things. We have commissions that set those things.
Right.
So I don't know if that's something in the charter that boards of finance should be addressing, or if that's how this is done. It's generally done through these commissions. That was my takeaway from that conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. And that was sort of my question, is whether that's something people feel should be changed, or people are, you know, the current Board of Finance people in the town are okay with that system.
Yeah, like should the Board of Finance be able to say, no, you're not going to charge $15 for a beach sticker, even though commission voted for it, you're going to charge $25? Like, is there, or should there be an override for that?
John Matola.
Why would that? I see why that could be a Board of Finance decision, but why wouldn't that be a decision by our first select person, who is overseeing the entire structure of our town government? I mean, there's only so much Board of Finance can do, and you want to give us purview over setting fees now? To me, it seems like that is an executive role that should be controlled by our executive who's running the town, if we want to go in that direction.
So
and then submit that as part of her budget.
Well, then I wonder then,
yeah,
how does the commission fit in with it? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
yeah, I think
interrupt you, John, but then I just wonder how, like, what the commission's role is. You know what I mean? I'm not arguing one way or another. I'm just asking.
Yeah.
Attorney Baldwin, did you have something?
Yes, I have a comment on that. I think that speaks to a very core issue of the way our town government has functioned historically and by tradition, our culture, if you will. And that is that we're comprised of many independent boards and commissions. And by doing that, you have many people involved in the community who have particular interest on a town board or commission. And I think what I've heard from many people is that that's a good thing. And they want to keep that kind of small town mentality. And as soon as you start consolidating the ability to raise fees across the board by a single body who's not in charge of that particular area, whether it's Parks and Rec or the marina or what have you, you're diluting that kind of historical culture of the town. And I think that's why we have it the way it is now.
I
agree.
Oh, are we finished on the fees topic?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
So I guess, you know, I was on the RTM for 1 or 2 terms. I can't even remember now. So, but I do not have a lot of experience in the town budgeting process. So this has been very helpful. And you all do, clearly. And we've had some great discussions, but I'm kind of, you know, it's 9:30 and I know that you guys were at a meeting last night and I don't want to keep everyone too long. And this is what we signed up for. But I guess where I'm falling short is that why we decided to address the budget as a topic. So we heard from individuals leading up to what the work plan and what we were going to address. One of the biggest things that I took away from that was coming from the administration saying, look, we've got a town to run. it takes 6 months or so to create and get a budget from start to finish. So they're practically starting it again by the time it's finished. And then there's governing the town with everything that's going on. So is there anything that can be done? Can you look at and come up with some recommendations as how to make this a more like efficient process without sacrificing any checks and balances? And so I would ask each of you on this to, if you were in our shoes, how would you answer that question? And if it's just, it's their job, they should do it because it works and that's the way it's been done, that's it. But are there new ways to look at this? And I guess that's really what I'm struggling with. So I don't know if each of you might take a brief, I'm not asking for an elevator pitch, but it is a late hour and I just wanted to see, like, am I missing something? And maybe the rest of these commissioners get it and I don't, and I'm alone here, so I apologize for that. But so if anybody would be willing to answer that, I'd be really appreciative of it. I guess not.
Mr. Schmidt has his hand up.
John Matola, let's
I'll go first.
Brian, can I just suggest that you use the word succinct rather than efficient? Because I think people are getting turned, I think they're mixing up things here. I think people are looking for this to be a more succinct process. Nobody's, and then we're sort of losing track, getting caught up in the word efficient.
Yeah, well,
pick your word.
Even if that language is used.
More facile maybe?
I don't know, Steve used a word I didn't know earlier. I gotta look it up.
Oh, which word was
I don't know. Is there a way to do this so it doesn't take 6 months? Is that an easy question?
Budget, can I tell you something? Budget processes take 6 months. They take a lot of time.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's the answer then, John.
And if you're going to start throwing the capital, if you're really going to do a capital, if you're going to put capital into it, that will even start earlier. In fact, some towns have their planning board as part of the capital process. So, that's...
Okay, we got a few takers now. Now I don't feel so rejected. I'm going to go to... Can I call you Lori?
Please. Yeah, I would. I think there's been as I said before, I think there's been a couple of worthy suggestions to consider. One around dates, one around the role of the Board of Selectmen. I do truly believe, though, that more of this is process-driven versus charter-driven, and I do believe there are absolutely ways to improve the process that we have, that it has, as I think as Steve pointed out, there's really nothing in the charter that governs the process that we go through. We made that up and it's here. And for better and for worse, it just sort of keeps happening the way it is. No one says we have to have 6 Board of Finance budget meetings or 3 Board of Selectmen meetings or whatever. We've created this process. Last night, we, had, I thought, a productive and interesting capital planning meeting. And one of the things the first Selectwoman said was she really wanted to convene a bipartisan working group, including members of her administration and some of the elected boards, to look at how that process could be improved. There was a recognition that what we were doing wasn't, optimal. And so I would just offer that because I think, again, our process isn't particularly prescriptive here. It's really not prescriptive, or did I say process or charter? Our charter is not prescriptive. And I think that much of what we do is just historical processes that we've continued on. And I think that is, maybe the source, much of the source of what ails, the folks that are, feel negatively about it. But there were 2 pretty interesting thoughts here, the role of the Board of Selectmen. And I do agree with Ms. Iacono about the dates. I think there can be some condensing of the dates. I think that may help. I just, I don't think you're going to entirely eliminate this issue of information changing because it will continue to happen, but it does bring some benefits. So thank you.
Thank you. I do appreciate that. Yeah. And John, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think that you had something to say as well. You're muted, so I'm not sure. There you go.
I was just going to say I agree with what Lori said, and it's the most important thing we do as a town, and it's going to take some time. So, in all due respect to department heads, that if I'm hearing from the administration that their department heads have to go to 2 or 3 meetings during the budget session, well, so what? That's their job. And I say that with all due respect. They're wonderful people and they do great work, but that's not a reason to change the process. So that's all I would say. And I agree. There's been some great suggestions here that I would love to consider. The Board of Selectmen issue, maybe condensing the time frame, as Lori and Pam said, or look into that. I'm fine with that. But it's the most important thing we do as a town. Thanks.
May I ask
Mr.
one?
Chair?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that. Jared had something to say. It looks like.
Yeah, I'll defer to Jared.
Thank you. A couple of things to Mr. Mottola. I mean, so what? So it doesn't need to be that way. There's another way to do this that they don't have to, and you can there would still be the same value to taxpayers and to the boards. I think that's the idea. We're looking for a solution here where where we can streamline things without totally losing the transparency and the value that the meetings bring. And I think there are ways to do that. And so I also, I think condensing the time frame is definitely possible and would be helpful. And there are identifiable things where we would gain more information over the time. And it's not all on the spending side, it's on the revenue side as well. For every amount of time that goes by, we're getting more information. And, we're in a situation now where we have a number of collective bargaining agreements that are out there and in the process of being negotiated. And, that it could be, if we delay if we push back the timing of the budget, the start time of the budget, that could be the difference between 1 or 2 of the agreements being settled. Utilities is another thing. We update that, we get an updated number from our purchasing director on a regular basis. And the only reason we don't get something that is later and more up to date is just because of that, because of when the deadlines are now. And so we wait and produce that number. He waits and produces that number because of the timelines that are set up now. If it were pushed back a month, he would have that much more time and that much more understanding of the issue. So there are without a doubt. So there would be more information that we would know and be able to better project what should be in the budget.
Okay. Thank you. Steve, did you have some follow-up or something?
I think we can hold it to the discussion on the budget.
Pam?
I just had one other question about budget process and timing and how things get delivered. And maybe Attorney Mednick is somebody who can answer this for me. Does the Board of Finance have to hear an item before the RTM? Are there towns that have legislative bodies that get it ahead of the RTM?
I'd have to look, but the normal process is that it runs from the executive to the Board of Finance to the either the RTM or the or the town meeting.
Town council.
Yeah, or town
Or the
council
town meeting.
for that matter. Yeah, and it really depends, and it depends on the structure. But even in New Haven, when I chaired the finance committee of the Board of Alders, we had a Board of Finance that was an appointed Board of Finance, and they got it before we did, which was quite irritating since we were the elected officials and they were appointed, and we got rid of them in the next charter. But they didn't have much defense on that one. But usually it goes that way. If you have a Board of Finance that serves that legislative function, that fiduciary and legislative kind of combined function, you're basically splitting the legislative function of a community, then it would go there. And my question, since you're raising it, Commissioner, or Pam, it's 9:30, I can call you Pam at 9:30, I think that's okay.
You can call me Pam no matter what.
Okay, we'll get a little less formal. One of the questions I was going to raise is in terms of duplication of effort, and Mark is still here. Does the RTM also bring all of the department heads before it during its budget process?
We can, but we have culled it down. We actually now ask, basically, who do you want to present? We don't have everybody present, no.
Right. Because
we're a little bit better about it.
Yeah, usually
we're a little bit better.
Yeah, usually obviously, the big things, right? Of course, you want to talk to police, fire. Of course, I said the BOE earlier. DPW, it's usually the big things. And then a lot of times we will have the charities or those type
nonprofit
organizations come before us. Because especially in the past, they last year asked for more money due to the pandemic. But there's one thing I remember.
The issue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I do remember it, and this is just probably as an aside. When we do approve, I remember we approved the renovation of the Burr Mansion kitchen, and a year later, I asked the question in the budget meeting, how's the new kitchen? And they said, we haven't done it yet. So we had allocated, whatever, $75,000 for this new kitchen that could have gone maybe somewhere else because they, for whatever reason, they couldn't get it done. So, yeah, the little things like that, but to your question, no, we've kind of pulled it down to what the broad range of the board wants to see, or the RTM wants to hear, or who they have questions for. And as like I said before, if you have actually watched the progress along the way, from the Board of Selectmen to the Board of Finance, et cetera, then you're pretty in tune. I mean, I take my budget book and I take notes about the questions that are asked and each line item that's being talked about during those meetings. So I'm well educated before it gets to me, at least, and I'm sure Pam's probably the same way. And I know others like that as well.
I call it following the bouncing ball. I always tell my caucus, you follow the bouncing ball. You need to start here, go to here, go to here, and it requires discipline from the people that are involved. But we do a better, a different job than the Board of Finance in asking the caucus leaders, who do you want to hear from? We still hear from a large number of them, but we at least poll our members, and if we don't need to hear from probate, we won't pull them in. We do it slightly differently in that regard.
And especially if if you go through the book and the budget number is the same and they consistently are spending X amount of dollars, then you might not need to hear from them at all. I would say that, when I was talking about the balance of power, say at the selectmen, and then Jim Baldwin made a good point. I was kind of thinking along the lines of, why do the selectmen have to vote? That's a good point.
I had another question, which has gone out of my head. Oh, in other towns, do they bring out all of their department heads, or is it a normal function to have the CFO and the budget director present, and then you don't have to have the Parks and Rec director there, or this is typical?
It is quite typical when you get into the legislative process. And again, I'm defining the legislative process as beginning with the Board of Finance. That the mayor very rarely goes and he or she may give a budget address, but it's the department heads that are making the presentations on a chapter by chapter, article by article basis. Where you have the additional rub is you have the public process of the Board of Selectmen that is more public than most executives. Mayors don't tend to have budget hearings as they're preparing the budget. They get the submissions from their departments. They have whatever individual meetings with those people, their finance people meet with them, whatever, and they formulate a budget, which then goes to the Board of Finance, if that exists, or the sole legislative body, if it's a city council or an RTM, or more like a city council than an RTM. And that's the way it goes. So the department heads are occupied, they're busy, but they're not involved in a public setting when they're doing it with the chief executive. They first would have a public setting with the Board of Finance in that scenario if we were to move in that direction.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
And just, I think, John made a point about, it's not that big of a deal, I guess, and Jared, I think, took a little offense to that. But the budget hearings for the Board of Finance and the RTM are at night. It's only the Board of Selectmen hearings that are during the day, which pulls away the department heads away from, and whoever else they need away from their jobs. So, and if they are there, I mean, now, the last 2 years it's been virtual, so everybody can do it from home. It's not like they have to leave their home. But it might be only for a couple of minutes. It might be for a half an hour, but it's not a killer. I mean, I've been to 3 meetings this week myself. Okay, I'm home, but this is my 3rd meeting since Tuesday night. I went to the Board of Ed meeting, and I'm not getting paid by the time, right?
But let me just ask, so don't you think, but like from a member of a public's perspective, wouldn't it be easier just to watch 1 or 2 of these things rather than have to watch it over and over again to figure out what's going on if you wanted to be engaged? And here, like, you want to know what the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance and the RTM are thinking, but now you've got to tune in 3 times. I don't know. Lori, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I think there's an assumption with that question that the same thing is always being repeated 3 times. And I don't think that's a consistently fair assumption. I mean, first of all, I don't want to be unappreciative. I realize it takes time for the department heads to come to meetings, but I think Mark made a fair point that, these, aside from the fact that they've been virtual, department heads don't come to all the Board of Finance meetings. It's only Jared who's stuck doing that. They will come to 1 meeting and 1 Board of Selectmen meeting. And again, what's happening is that, I believe there's an evolution of questions and issues get settled and it gets streamlined as it goes on. I do acknowledge that that's not always the case. There may be some times that I'm not just going to blame it on the RTM, but at an RTM meeting, perhaps the Board of Finance meeting where, some member wants to go on the record and make a public statement and they ask a question for that person, for that purpose. And that's
never happens.
Never happens, right? So that's just part of the process. It does happen, but I don't think it's, necessarily a fair assumption to say that, you have 3 meetings that unfold the same way. I think that's not the case. And And while there may be a little of that, I don't think that's, predominantly what happens. I think the ones that have it the toughest, quite frankly, are the Board of Ed, because they have by far the biggest budget. When they come before us, it's the entire evening is devoted to them. So they spend a lot of time, and they have to do the same thing with the Board of Selectmen and the RTM. But again, even they have acknowledged that, the nature of the presentation and what they're going to talk to us about does change based on what they've gone through previously. And so I just offer that because I really appreciate what you're saying. And I think if it was the case that we were just, that this was completely duplicative 3 times, I would wholeheartedly agree with you. And if it was the case that this was, we had department heads spending hours and hours at these meetings every day, I would also agree. But I don't think that's necessarily how it unfolds. I think that, the toughest part of it is obviously the CFO sits here through all of these, but it's not, it may not be what you're assuming. So
Gotcha.
thank you.
Okay.
And I sorry, just to follow up, I think each set of meetings has a uniqueness to it and a difference to it that makes them all different. You go from 3 people to 9 people to 40 people. And each meeting has a different spin to it, and the questions are different. And I think that point was made earlier that, by the time you get to the RTM, you may be thinking more about my district, my constituents, what's bothering them, or what do they want in a budget, and what can they not afford. They can afford not to lose in a budget. So
that was my point in the beginning, which is, I agree with that. Each board has somewhat different priorities, and they look at this budget a different way. So one way, and again, Brian, I think we are answering your question a few times actually, and what I heard is the way to streamline this is you're going to have to change the structure and who votes and the timing of the votes. Because if you're an elected official and you vote, you want to talk to the person that is in charge of that budget.
Right.
But again, the Board of Finance also doesn't necessarily speak to every single department head. It's the ones that make a difference, whether the revenue generating or the expenses that are public safety, DPW, right? You're always going to want to speak to that department. And you're going to want to talk to, you want to talk to the director of Park and Rec, because there's a lot of revenue that gets generated out of that budget. You're going to want to talk to that person. So it's the way it's set up. So if you want to change it, change the way it's set up, and the process will change. And I'm sure there's more ideas, and I'll be glad to, after this meeting, put some more thoughts together.
Great.
But I like right off the bat the 2 ideas that I heard, put more thought into them and see what else that I can come up with to support your cause here.
No, it's just, maybe it's nothing. I mean, it's not my cause. I'm just a terror.
I'm talking about the commission's cause, not your cause. I'm talking about the commission's role here, which is important. And I'm sure there's other ideas that will come from this discussion that we have here tonight.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And if you would put more thought into those 2 ideas and get back to us, that'd be great too. So I appreciate that. Well, I unless anybody has anything else or final thoughts.
Can I just say,
Sure.
We have a calendar that we're trying to follow as the Charter Commission, and the sooner you can get those thoughts in, the better it would be. We're meeting again in 2 weeks. We have a different matter that we're gonna be discussing, but I was gonna ask the chair if we might schedule some deliberation time, some reflection time for the commission to discuss what we heard tonight, so they can give me some direction on where I need to go. And I would also encourage members of the commission in the next few days, if there are things they want me to look into based on what they've learned tonight, let me know sooner than later so I can update the information I've provided to you. But I also want to thank, since I've called many of you to be here tonight, I want to thank all of you. I don't want to steal the thunder of the chair, but you know, I think it was a very instructive night, and it went much longer than I thought it was going to go. So I greatly appreciate the time that you put into it.
Yeah, I echo that. You've been more than generous with your time, and it's been a very healthy and spirited conversation. And so I thank all of you, and you know, it's been enlightening for me. So I'm sure it has for everyone else. But I appreciate you all being here, and hopefully you make yourselves available should we have some follow-up questions as this process continues. And thank you again for all your service. You know, I know it's. I'm remembering this is a big time commitment that you all have, so thanks. So we do have one other matter on our agenda. You're welcome to stay, but you don't have to. We're going to hear from our council on the presentation of a reorganization of the draft charter, which is not, you know, we're not. This is not the change to the charter here. It's he will explain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
you all.
you.
You guys. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
And I won't take too much of your time on this because I wanted to explain what I sent out this week. What I sent out this week is kind of the first run at consolidating and restructuring the charter. It won't look vastly different, and I do have to go through it and get rid of these green comments. They look like looks like a document that came through the CIA. So I want to I'll have to clean that up. But you'll see what I tried to do is I tried to consolidate and begin restructuring the document without changing anything. There are a couple of new concepts in there. That's why I think I colored them. I thought I colored them light blue, but I guess I colored them green. And then a lot of the green areas are areas that have been brought up in our discussions that are areas of the charter that people want us to look at. So I'll come up with a different color so that they're noted. But what I tried to do is I'm trying to move into sections process issues. For example, in Article 2, I've moved a number of provisions around from in the back of the document to move it up front so that things are stated once and they're stated in one place. And there'll be more of that as we go through the document so that we don't keep repeating certain phrases or certain processes throughout the document. At the most, we will refer back to the section in Article 2 where this is referenced. You'll also notice I took out the charts from the opening of the charter that breaks down the appointments and the boards and the commissions and the elected officials, and I put it in the back of the document. And when it's done, it might be useful to have an addendum at the back of the document that gives somebody kind of a skeletal version of what the government looks like. I wanted to get right down to the business of laying out what the government is. I also I consolidated the Board of Selectmen and the executive branch and Board of Selectmen articles into one. It's all about the executive branch. I forget who raised the question about whether the first selectman was the chief executive. That's the section where that's addressed, where the Board of Selectmen has an executive function, and the first selectwoman has executive powers. I haven't done any editing at all with regard to gender or anything like that. As we start going through the document, we will do that. So what I also did is I tried to break down in the sections on appointments. You have all sorts of different appointment authorities. In many charters, it's pretty easy. The first selectman appoints, the RTM confirms, if there's a legislative confirmation process. Here you have a lot of different appointing authorities. You have the first selectman, the board of selectmen. You have some officers and bodies that are appointed by other bodies other than those entities, and then in some cases in one case you have self-perpetuating appointments by the Board of Library Trustees. So I tried to create categories so that a member of the public could take a look at this and understand how these things break down. And that's, again, just the first run on going through the document. So that is kind of all I am. Oh, the other thing, I'm sorry, the other thing I did want to mention, you'll see at the bottom of the page, so that we can, as we track this document, since we're reorganizing the document, we're going to be making changes to the document. I thought it was important to have annotations at the baseline of the document. Jim Baldwin gave me a number of the special acts, not all of the special acts, and I integrated into the annotations the historical special acts, so that we can, as we go through, and you say, gee, Steve, we'd like to change this, I might say to you, if you change it, you're giving something up. The two things that I see principally that you need to think about giving up, one is the structure of our government with the Board of Selectmen and First Selectman as being kind of the executive. That is something you have from Special Act that if you give it up, you can't go back to it. The other thing is, in the Board of Selectmen, there is a subpoena authority, which is not a normal authority that is granted to any boards except Board of Ethics and civilian review boards that deal with police departments. Those are the only two entities that I'm aware of that have general subpoena authority unless you have it from your special act. So as we go through this, you'll see those annotations at the bottom, and the annotations also are keyed into, you'll see the term recodification, because I have recodified a lot of the sections here. So we can look back and see where it was in the current charter, so that if somebody's doing research at some point, they can go back and see where this section was derived from. So in the future, we won't be wondering where the provisions of the charter came from. So so that's it. That's the first step. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, I'll let you know a little bit about the next meeting, if that's okay. But I'll happy to answer any questions.
Just one quick question.
Yes, sir.
So in the way of streamlining any of the wording, and I'm looking at section 1.2, and we start off that section by saying all the inhabitants dwelling within the town of Fairtown, and it continues. Could that be shortened to all the residents instead of inhabitants dwelling within? I mean, it's just, there's so many words in here that I don't think in current common usage is essential.
Which section?
It's section 1.2. I just picked on that one because it happened to be up on my screen here.
Yeah, I mean, we could. That's current language. I didn't change it at all.
Right. I'm just wondering if someone read through this just in an effort to streamline without changing intent or meaning, is there any benefit in doing that?
There is benefit if you want to do that. I'll leave that up to the commission. The only thing I'd be concerned, I want to make sure we don't distort any legal requirements, but the incorporation provisions could certainly be written in simple English or in plain English, plain spoken English,
right,
as opposed to some 19th century legalistic formula. So right. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Even if I wrote it, I tell you there's no pride in authorship, but I didn't write that. So happy to, it's something you can consider when you find something that is difficult to read or understand.
Okay. And I won't try and do it tonight.
No, not tonight. If I may, Mr. Chairman, let me just briefly, at our next meeting, we are going to be starting our discussion on town governance. And I have 2 speakers that have confirmed and an invitation out to the third, Joe DeLong from CCM, the Executive Director and CEO of CCM and the former Majority Leader of the West Virginia State Legislature, will be our keynote. He'll talk broadly about Connecticut municipalities. Professor Gary Rose, we have 2 universities in Fairfield. One is Sacred Heart. He's the chair of the government department at Sacred Heart, and has recently written a book not too long ago on local government in New England. And we had a really terrific conversation, and he will be part of a panel, I hope, with Gail Alberta. I've put in a call to Professor Alberta at my alma mater at Fairfield, and she had done some work with the town in the past and has a pretty good feel for the town. So I was hoping those 2 academics would be helpful in giving us a broad oversight over the forms of government in Connecticut. Part of the materials I'll give you are some of the statutory requirements for municipalities, as well as a complete listing of all the towns in the state of Connecticut, indicating their population and their forms of government. It's kind of a first step toward looking at what's around you, who else is there. The subsequent meeting to that, my hope will be to invite representatives of the different forms of government. Some other RTM governments, maybe Greenwich or Darien, to get a feel for what they do, if there's anything that they do. You probably don't want to replicate the size of their RTM, 100 in Darien and 330 plus in Greenwich, but there may be other things that they can talk about that they do that would be useful for you to think about. I also want to invite representatives of mayor council and manager council forms of government, so that you'll have an opportunity to hear from those types of people. My hope at the next meeting, if it's okay with the chair, I'll talk to the chair and vice chair tomorrow, is to see if we could add some time to that meeting to have some preliminary discussion, because if we don't take this in a linear way, then we're going to forget everything we learned tonight. And I think we should try to have some discussion about direction on the budget, so that I can have a sense of what it is I need to prepare for you. And if in the interim you have any thoughts and ideas, as I said a few minutes ago, let me know. That's it for me. At 10:02 in the evening.
10:02. Any questions or comments from commission? All right. Well, thank you, Attorney Mednick, for everything. I think this was a very productive evening, and I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Seconded by John Vitola. Moved by John Wynn. Good night, everyone. Thank you very much.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, all. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.